my friends. Oh, I've missed you. And I'm so happy to be back, bringing you season 3 of Cake Over Keto. Slap bang in the middle of what I can only describe as a midlife crisis. I have no idea what women tend to do when in the midst of this. Who the hell am I? Whose is this body? And what the hell is it doing phase? I've coloured my hair, which feels very underwhelming, but I do think I found a new hobby that I'll tell you about later. I'm Mel Wakeman, registered nutritionist and non-diet counsellor. I specialise in disordered eating, recovering from chronic dieting, body dissatisfaction, and eating disorder recovery through weight-inclusive and neurodivergent affirming lenses. Now, if, like me, your memory is not quite as it once was, let me remind you where I left you. And if you're new here, welcome aboard. I don't know quite where I'm going bus, but I ended season 2 by sharing my late diagnosis of ADHD and autism. I only discovered this in January, so it's really early days in processing the 49 years that I've spent on this planet, much of it spent blaming myself for being crap at quite a few things and finding life hard. So I guess it's understandable I'm having a slight identity crisis, but the relief and hope I now have, because I now know why everything felt so hard, means this is where the fun starts. It's time to find out who I really am, to let go of the shoulds and do the stuff I want and need to do. And I'd love it if you come on at least part of this journey with me. I am still standing up against diet culture because it's a big problem for the neurodivergent community. This series will be exploring the perplexities of being neurodivergent and eating in a world that has very particular rigid views about what eating healthily is supposed to look like. So we're going to rip up the rule book. If you find food boring, struggle to get eating even on your radar, or maybe you find food and everything about it fascinating and comforting, but something you obsess over a little bit too much, I see you. If eating certain foods makes you feel really uncomfortable, or the people around you drive you nuts when they eat, you are not alone. And if you're worried about your relationship with food and are feeling a bit stuck, get the kettle on and press subscribe. Here's what's coming up. This is episode 21, Desperately Seeking Dopamine. And it's about how dopamine imbalances can affect eating in neurodivergent folk in terms of binge, compulsive and restricted eating. Growing up in the 80s with Madonna, you may well know about getting into the groove. The thing is, we need dopamine to do that. And neurodivergent brains can be somewhat unpredictable when it comes to dopamine functioning. Now, we can unearth dopamine like heat-seeking missiles. And that's a brilliant skill to have in terms of meeting our needs, but also like if we're starting something new or we want to learn in a week what neurotypical folk may take months to do. But then sometimes our missile just stops. The thrill of the seek is over. You've bought your smoothie maker extraordinaire and matching air fryer, and you've used them for breakfast, lunch and dinner for the last 3 weeks. But then nothing. And you forget and they get put away and gather dust in a cupboard somewhere. It's the same with eating experiences. They can feel marvelously exciting or dull as ditch water. They can feel out of control or nothing short of disappointing. This is about living life in extremes. So I'm going to explain why this happens and how we can find some calm and safety amongst the highs and the lows. And the pick and mix at the end will contain some nuggets for your toolkit. So without further ado, let's get into this. Right, let's get into what dopamine does and how it can affect eating. Dopamine is involved in feelings of desire, and it's part of our brain's reward system. It drives us to take action. It motivates us to seek things out like food that support our body, make us feel good and help us function. When we experience pleasure from said action, and let's just say having a biscuit with your cuppa, the reward pathway is activated and goes, oh, nice, I'll be doing that again. So it reinforces the action that we took to have the biscuit with our tea. And through repeating that a few times, we learn to tap into simply the expectation of the future reward, regardless of how long that lasts or what happens after. Now, if parts of our brain lack dopamine, and this is what we know is the case with neurodivergent brains, and let me just talk about ADHD for a moment, it would make sense for us to go and find some. Food is a relatively easy and convenient way to get some. If it wasn't so bloody expensive, mind you. Anyway, various things about food can trigger the release of dopamine in our brain. It's really individual. Now, ADHD brains, they need stimulation, they get bored easily. So if we choose foods that provide stimulation and novelty, it's a type of way of self-medicating really to get the dopamine that we need. So this might look like buying a new variety of biscuit that you've been waiting for, discovering sweets that fizz and pop in your mouth, or maybe just making a decision about eating more veggies. You're excited about the idea of right, okay, I'm going to be, helping myself or starting a health kick. So you go out and buy loads, which, by the way, often ends up with soggy remnants left in the salad drawer. And yes, it was a great idea at the time, but then you forgot or you got bored. Now, certain foods may help us to get a little bit more dopamine compared to some, but again, it's really variable. Now, protein can be pretty cool because it contains 2 amino acids called tyrosine and phenylalanine, and our brain will convert them into dopamine, which is kind of cool. Now, we're talking, probably eggs and meat and fish, nuts, beans, that sort of thing. But what if these don't fit in with your food preferences? Because I'm not going to tell you to eat these if the idea of these make you shudder or trigger you. And there's a lot of diet culture-y, neurotypical advice out there around eat this, not that, for ADHD and autism. But it can be super unhelpful if your relationship with food is already strained and food causes you anxiety. And I find it's rare to hear, go on, have some chocolate without it, but not too much. And chocolate, by the way, contains a compound called tyramine, which the brain cleverly also uses to make dopamine. So we have ways to, self-medicate. But what I see more often than not is sugary food causes surges in dopamine, and that's bad for you because crappy diet culture and society sees sugar as evil and addictive. And it's not, by the way. And if you go back to episode 11, Help, I Think I'm Addicted to Food, there'll be more on that. So when we're munching away on the sweets, we're told that's a problem. We're told we're a problem. We are shamed for doing so because, duh, that's so bad. Have you got no willpower? How about you just don't eat that? And, it's no wonder our body trust and self-esteem is eroded away. It's no wonder difficult relationships with food are more common in neurodivergent folk, because neurotypical ways of eating and rules are shoved down our throats, the ways that completely exclude and pathologize our approaches and behaviors around food. Now, there are a number of reasons why neurodivergent folk are at a greater risk of eating problems and eating disorders. Like folk with ADHD are more likely to experience binge eating behaviors and develop binge eating disorder. And one of the reasons is that go get some dopamine now can be really intense. Like it means right now. And this is what I mean by desperately seeking dopamine. There's a real sense of urgency. And because low dopamine is linked to impulsivity, this can be problematic for some. And eating can be erratic, compulsive, and feel out of control. But that still doesn't mean we need to stop eating or avoid food groups or beat ourselves up. We are not the problem. The eating is not the problem. Other aspects of executive function difficulties, I don't like the word, kind of disorder really, we see in ADHD include problems with planning, short-term memory, making decisions, managing time, prioritizing tasks. And this can mean we just don't eat enough or regularly, because deciding on what to eat, making a list, shopping for it, cooking and actually eating can be like trudging through thick mud. And this in itself can contribute to eating problems like binge eating, because it's the body's response to, you've not fed me enough. And let's not forget, we can feel emotions in a big way. The difficult ones can be intense and hard to manage, especially when you're in it. And sometimes we get overwhelming sadness and anger. And I've had the rage, believe you me. The easy emotions, maybe the fun, the laughter, the dancing, they can be loud and embarrassing for others. Oh, hello, shame and low self-esteem again. So, of course, these feelings open the door for more dopamine-seeking behaviours to try and combat the feeling shit about yourself for eating either the quote-unquote wrong foods or for making a prat of yourself in front of others. And you can see a cycle appearing. But it makes sense that food is a source of comfort and security, as well as dopamine. I've always said emotional eating is human. It's a valid way to cope, to try and self-regulate whilst trying to navigate life. I don't believe there's anything to be ashamed of for dopamine seeking with food. I don't see it as something to be curbed or prevented. It's why I don't like dopamine detoxes and dopamine fasts, which have gained traction in recent years. Because how can we even detox dopamine or fast from it? Because we can't stop making it. Even if we're only making a tiny bit, it just doesn't make sense. And ripping off the plaster by trying to avoid food will often only increase anxiety. Food restriction and abstinence often exacerbates binge eating and delays recovery. We need a different approach here. We need to add extra layers of support, not take them away. And this is something I'll come back to in a later episode. But in the meantime, I do have some suggestions in the pick and mix for some non-food dopamine button pressers to go into your toolkits. Okay, so I've talked about the dopamine-seeking eater. Now this leads nicely onto the can't-be-arsed eater. And what I mean by this is eating just isn't a priority for some. And I know all too well the reality of having a brain that just won't do something, even if you really want it to. Now, I mentioned that ADHD brains like novelty, fun stuff, funky, quirky stuff. And for some, cooking isn't any of these. There's things that just take too long to make. Or like, who loves chopping onions or peeling potatoes? Or they're too complicated. Or there's too many steps. So just beginning a task can feel too much because you know it's going to make your head hurt. But having a lump of cheese or a packet of crisps for lunch isn't really enough, is it? Like, we can't live on that. In my experience, when I'm into something else, I completely lose track of time and I forget to eat. If I'm hyper-focusing, the idea of switching tasks to go downstairs and make myself a sandwich has zero appeal. I can feel like really annoying. But it's actually important we learn how to do this at times to prevent that downward spiral of having even less dopamine, falling blood sugars, getting hangry, that feeds and ramps up the existing anxiety, impulsivity, and feeling even more crap. And all of this is made even harder because neurodivergent folk can really struggle to know when we're hungry and full for that matter. We have very low interoceptive awareness. And there's medications, that's another episode, that can reduce our appetite. And when we stop and start them, it's no wonder eating doesn't feel natural, you know? When I'm working in my zone, which at the moment is being in my garden, and my husband asks me, what do I want for dinner? I really couldn't care less. It's not me being rude. And it's not that I don't care what I eat or don't care about myself. But unless he's got some options for me to visualize in my head and that triggers some dopamine and anticipation, I struggle to make a decision. The last thing we need in these situations is for people to go, just do it. Like, why can't you do it? What's wrong with you? And I'm very lucky because I have this brilliant husband who has taken on much of the cooking role. It has literally saved us from living on cereal and cheese on toast all week. So if you're struggling with this too, please go easy on yourself. It's not because your brain is the problem, it's the world that we live in. Lastly, we have the highly sensitive eater. I've talked so far about seeking food for dopamine, stimulation and comfort. But what if you don't want or need any more dopamine? What if stimulation is exactly what you don't need? There are theories that suggest autistic folk can have higher levels of dopamine or a high dopamine sensitivity in some parts of their brain. Now, this is like turning up the volume on everything you hear and feel and see. It can become all-consuming and for some create a different set of challenges around eating or add to existing ones in the form of food preoccupation and avoidance. Let me just add a caveat here. We can't put neurodivergent brains into separate boxes. There's simply way too much variation. Many of the traits overlap, and it's not just all about dopamine either. We've got differences in noradrenaline and serotonin too. But take my brain, for instance. It has both ADHD and autistic traits, and they absolutely competed with each other when I was younger. When it came to food, I was the controlled, restricted eater who also impulsively binged. So yes, I am oversimplifying things here, I think, with my examples, but I just felt it would be a helpful way to explain some of the differences and challenges without confusing myself or you along the way. Many of the eating difficulties experienced by autistics are due to sensory processing issues and anxiety. And these can be exacerbated by the environment we live in, a lack of understanding, lack of accommodations, and rigid expectations about what eating is supposed to look like. Autistics can experience very high and very low sensitivity to sound, smells, textures, tastes, colours, light, temperature. So someone who has a low sensitivity might seek out very strong flavours, smells, and stimulating textures. And this is where salt and vinegar crisps or Nerds gummy custards can be particularly helpful. Being highly sensitive can make eating a very overwhelming and it's distressing experience. It can trigger meltdowns or shut down. Certain foods, say salty or spicy, can be painful to eat. There may be repulsion to bits and mush and slimy soft textures, causing shaking or feeling sick or gagging. This is not just picky eating. And what is okay for one person can not be enough or way too much for someone else. But for a highly sensitive autistic, we can't just turn off that dopamine. Instead, we have to focus on reducing the triggers and carefully managing the anxiety around the food that they're experiencing. Anxiety is an incredibly strong driver for food fixation, as are difficult, intense emotions and traumatic experiences. Rigid thinking, repetitive behaviours, preference for order and exactness are common traits in autism to help cope with this anxiety. And for some, that makes them at a much higher risk of developing a restrictive eating disorder. It's why we see anorexia and ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, more often in this group. Again, it's complex, and eating is often not for want of trying. But when food activates your nervous system, isn't it understandable to not want to eat if you feel unsafe or you believe it might make you ill or that it will be bad for you? I'm going to be coming back to sensory processing issues again next time. But if you have some suggestions that have helped you with any aspects of your eating, I would love to hear them. Please do get in touch by sending me an email to mel@wakemannutrition.com or come and find me over on Instagram. And if you've got any feedback you'd like to share about this episode so far, I am all ears. Now hang on just a second, the pick and mix is about to be opened. Okay, I have 4 nuggets you might find helpful if you're wanting to help yourself eat in perhaps nourishing ways that support your brain and your body. Number 1, reminders. Reminders. I'm not a rule fan, but supportive structure I am. If you regularly forget to eat, you're going to need some alarms. maybe 3 or 4 for the meal that you struggle with most. Set them on your phone, maybe with an image of something eating, or in whatever way is going to help prompt you to go eat when you see the alarm. You might find visual lists of your same foods or safe snacks and meals that you're into at the moment on the kitchen cupboards, on your fridge, or on your phone helpful too. Number 2, what can make eating more appealing for you? Like, no rules here. If you need to eat standing up, moving around, do that. Play some music, put on a video, use your phone, your favourite plate, bowl or cutlery. Maybe think about body doubling for accountability. So this is kind of doing something with somebody else. Even if they're not there, you can do this via, phone and WhatsApp or whatever. Even if they're not eating, although it often helps if they are, if you find that difficult. Number 3, make a dopamine toolkit with activities that make you happy. These are the ones that we can layer onto using food. So mine are spending time with my favourite people, which is mostly my husband, painting my house with lively colours, wearing bright clothes, not on all days, but maybe some days, changing my hair colour, watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine, they've got a new series out by the way, playing with my dogs, getting in the sun, going roller skating. I have just discovered this one. Oh my God, it was amazing. I haven't been on them for about 35 years, but it is kind of like riding a bike. Number 4, focus on safety. What helps you to reduce your anxiety or decompress? It might be focusing on beige foods and brown coloured foods, letting go of the colour and the stimulation. It could be eating alone or in silence, not having your foods touch, the lights not being too bright, playing your favourite song on repeat, wearing headphones or a hat. Whatever you need to do that aligns with your body, do that. I'm giving you permission to do that. Okay, so that's it from me today, folks. Thank you for coming back and taking the time to listen. In case you didn't know, episodes are released fortnightly, so I'll look forward to seeing you next time. And remember, be gentle with yourself. You always make sense. Bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.